All right, youth workers, today I have a fantastic interview today with somebody whom I met through a community where we're learning how to build courses and how to engage and things like this, and ran along into this nice lady who took mercy upon me and said she would love to talk about a topic that I was really excited about talking about, and that was about parents and youth ministry. And so I want to welcome to the show Jennifer Uren. Welcome, Jennifer.
Oh, thank you.
And we talked. You said earlier in our conversation we talked about being accidental, but I don't think this was accidental. I don't think us meeting one another within that community was accidental, because now it's turned into something very real here, that we're going to get some great information into the eyes and ears of youth workers.
Yes, accidental and providential sometimes feel the same.
Yes, they do. Absolutely. And I also want to point out to those that are listening and those that are watching via YouTube is that you are not, I want to make it clear that you are not one of my parents. You're not a parent of any of the youth ministries or any of the youth groups, because that would be biased. And I didn't want to be biased, and so I want to make sure I got an unbiased opinion, really, of parents and youth ministry, and that's what we're going to talk about today. But before we jump into that, before we get into the parent youth worker dynamic, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? Tell us a little about maybe how many kids you have and your family, and I'm sure that people listening and watching would like to know this.
Sure. Well, my husband and I live in the Chicagoland area, the northern suburbs, and we have 5 kids. Our oldest is 19 and a freshman in college. And then we have a son who is almost 17. He's a junior in high school, and he's starting to be dual enrolled at the community college. So we're straddling worlds with him. We have a 6th grader, middle school, who just started youth group. And then we have a 4-year-old son and a 3-year-old daughter. So we have many, many years of youth ministry ahead of us still.
That is a wide gap. That is a wide range of children and ages. And yes, like you said, you have experienced and have yet to experience the youth ministry spectrum of having all these kids, go through or be a part or start or graduate from or any of those things. And so I think you become a great voice for both the parenting community and also the youth ministry community, because youth pastors and parents oftentimes have that dynamic where there's multiple kids or and things like that. And so I think your point of view is certainly going to be helpful to those that are listening. Let me ask you this question: have you tell me a little bit about your youth group? Did you grow up in a youth group? Did you have a youth pastor and all that?
Well, kind of. I grew up, my dad was a pastor, and I was one of those fortunate kids where we didn't move around. We were in the same church for 13 years. So I watched the youth group. I was so excited to be part of the youth group. And we had junior high, so you couldn't start youth group till 7th grade. We didn't have middle school. And so when I started youth group in about 7th grade, within a year of my starting, the vast majority of the students and their families moved on to other churches. So we were left with 4 or 5 of us at most. And so we didn't have a youth pastor. We had a volunteer worker. And we did some things, but it wasn't what I observed growing up. And so we found most of the time as the youth group, we were either helping run the kids ministry or we were tagging along with the college and career age, which we did not belong there. And so it was not your typical youth group experience.
And I think that is such a great story, in the sense that I think it's so relatable to a lot of our listeners and viewers, because a lot of the churches that I serve are smaller. They are truncated a lot of times because they have to have 7th graders, older high school, some college age, maybe 10 to 15 students. And so you have that perspective. And I think too, youth workers, this is a tip here that I just kind of thought about. was think about this when you're talking to parents, ask them what their youth group experience was like. Because I think if you hear that, you're going to, they have some parents already have an idea in their brain of maybe what a youth group looks like. So if you're having conflict, maybe talk to them about their youth group experience as Jennifer has just shared here, because I think that tells me a lot of what she was used to or what she grew up in, and maybe what her hopes are for her daughter. Have you ever, Jennifer, have you ever served on a youth ministry team as you grew up, and as you or even in your dad's church? Did you ever serve as a volunteer or anything like that?
Not with the youth ministry directly. I did a lot with the younger kids. When my first job out of college, I worked for a mission agency where I planned trips for youth pastors to take their youth groups overseas. So I worked with high school and college age trips that way, but not directly. I've never been a youth volunteer, and my daughter had not wanted me to be. Because we had such a small youth group, she didn't want me to be part of it. So, so we didn't do that.
Well, let me tell you what. Let me just stop there for a moment, because that's an extra bonus here. What do you say to youth workers who have parents who want to be a part, but kids don't want them to be a part?
Yeah.
What do you suggest to them in that? Because you obviously honored your child's request.
Yes.
Some parents may not do that, but what do you suggest? First of all, to parents, address the parents, and then say, how would you help a youth worker address that to a parent who wants to be a part when their child does not want them to be a part?
Yeah, well, I think you have to have a lot of discretion as to whether you move forward with a parent being involved or not, or as a parent, whether you do. And I think it's partially dependent on the size of the youth ministry. My mother-in-law was involved in my brother-in-law's youth ministry as a leader to girls, but there were like 150 kids, so she didn't see them. Yeah. So that's different. Because having your mom or dad there could be a hindrance. But I think parents can do a lot. They can donate things, they can pick up pizza, they can offer to be drivers, they can be administrative support, and so on. But I think the important thing is that there needs to be the freedom to ask for or offer help, but there also has to be the freedom to accept it or decline it. It shouldn't be mandatory of either thing, expected or be a put off. If help is offered and the youth pastor says thank you, but that's not needed, great. I think that's the important thing.
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point too, because you don't want your mom or your dad leading the small group discussion in February on sex and dating.
Correct.
That's going to be a little awkward.
Nor do mom or dad want to do that with their child.
Not in a group setting anyway.
No. Certainly
not in a group setting. As you think back and just going back to your youth group experience, what can you tell me about the youth, although you didn't have a youth pastor, tell me a little bit about your youth leader and maybe how you saw them. I don't know if you ever saw them deal with parents or things like that, or things you might remember, but give us some insight into your youth leader.
Yeah, I never really saw them interact with parents. Probably half of our kids came to church without their parents, and so they were from unchurched families, and so I never saw that side of it because I just didn't see the parents. They did work really hard when there were like district or denominational events. We would go with another youth group, team up with them. So we didn't miss out. We got to participate, but we didn't know the kids or the leaders, so there weren't relationships there. And so that's probably one thing I think I missed in my youth group growing up. And one of the things that I think is so important is the relationship. So the size doesn't matter as much as the connection does.
Right. And that's also a great point, because so many youth pastors, depending on, size of their youth ministry, things like that, it changes, right? If you have 150 kids, you have one kind of relationship with, it's hard to manage all the parent relationships. Or if you have a small youth group where you have, only a dozen parents maybe to deal with, then that's a whole nother thing as well.
Yeah.
So, and we talked about how we were going to ask this question about where you're at too. And I thought maybe I'll rephrase it this way. We talked about, your relationship with whether your kids are how many kids do you have in youth group right now?
At the moment, I have 2 kids in youth group.
2 kids in youth group right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if your youth pastor will hear this or not, but how would you define right now the youth group experience for your kids and how that's working for them? And how are you engaging with your youth pastor?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to actually back up a little, and just with the older kids, my daughter, historically, our kids' youth pastors have been our peers. They've been the same age as my husband and I. We've been friends. We've done things socially outside of youth group and church. But that has shifted, and it's shifting for a couple of reasons. And one is that our current youth pastor, who's actually an associate pastor with youth responsibility, is a fresh seminary grad, and I could be his mother. I'm old enough to be his mother, so I'm no longer a peer.
Yes.
The other is that our high school age son, he actually switched youth groups a couple of years ago to a different church involved. And so while I've had conversation with that youth pastor, and I really respect him and like him, I don't have a relationship with him per se. So that's different. And then the addition of these littles to our family, which was completely unexpected, has meant that I can't engage the way, with my daughter now and my son, the way I could with my older daughter, because I could go to things, I could drop everything, I could be available. And now I have childcare and I have other things. So I'm not as engaged as I used to be.
And you have younger kids, which I think you had said earlier in our conversation that, or before we got online here, is that these are adoptive, yes?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm a big fan of adoption. I just want to say that because I myself am adopted, as is my wife.
Oh, neat.
So both of us, kudos to you for adopting.
Well, thank you.
We think that's pretty special. You had mentioned also before we got on the air about your daughter having your older daughter having a significant experience and connection with their youth pastor or youth worker or youth leader in the ministry. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, our oldest daughter, we had a youth leader who, she was phenomenal. She was a volunteer. And when she saw the girls who were in 5th grade that would be coming up into the youth group, she began developing relationship with those girls and their moms. She had a knitting class with the girls and their moms. So we were doing things together, and she was getting to know us. And then as they transitioned into youth group, she began to do things one-on-one with the girls. So we've established a relationship as mom with her, and the girls have established a relationship. And she did some things in groups and some things one-on-one. But what I really appreciated was it was a relationship my daughter felt safe in, and it was a relationship I felt safe having her in. And the understanding was whatever she shared with this gal was in confidence, unless it was something that she felt I needed to be aware of that would be of a concern. And even then, she wouldn't give me details. She might speak in generalities. So when my daughter and I were having a hard time communicating through some of those tough teenage years, I was able to say, have you spoken to so-and-so? And what did she say? And she had that freedom and that place to go when it was too tough to talk to me. And I felt completely confident in what she would say, because it wasn't undermining me. It wasn't behind my back. It was parallel to me as a parent.
That is so critical because youth workers, whether you're, a lot of youth workers may or may not be good. Like you said, you have a younger youth pastor who is no longer your peer. They are not younger youth pastors. And I speak from experience, are not always the best at relationship building upward, maybe as with an older, with parents that are, older than them, obviously. And trying to find those connection points. And if you're not good youth pastors, if you're the lead youth pastor, empower your volunteers, just like this young lady did. Empower your volunteers then to build those relationships, to do things that are relational. There's a lot of youth pastors that are not relational. They're really good at preaching. They're really good at organizing. They're really good at theology, but they're not necessarily good at relationships. They're good at running the ministry. But they forget that there's what makes the ministry run are parents. You know, kids don't get there unless they drive, unless their parents bring them. They're kind of the, you know, the vehicle, literally the vehicle by which you have children in your youth ministry. And the fact that you said that this young lady, you know, created opportunities, and youth pastors, you can do the same thing. You can have a club. You can have a thing with a kid, a mom-daughter thing, or a father-son thing, whether that's fishing or knitting or something that, you know, making your events family-friendly almost, where you say, look, we're going bowling. Let's have a family bowling night, not just a youth bowling night, you know? But I think I think we're leading right into the next question, which really we're talking about parent ministry, and how youth workers can build a good parent ministry with parents, and how parents can create a good parent ministry through their own initiative. So let's start with the youth pastor, and let's talk about how you can define what good parent ministry is, or what you're looking for from the youth pastor, whoever leads your children. How would you then describe a good parent ministry?
Well, just like our kids are going through their teen years for the first time and experiencing these things for the first time, we're often parenting a child through those things for the first time as well. And so just because we have age on our side and experience in other things doesn't mean that we have the experience of doing this with our kids. So I think that that is what good parent ministry is. It's, for example, maybe offering during Sunday school hours or a special parent meeting, discussing, you know, hey, here's a book I would really recommend that you read. It's what we've read and what we're basing this curriculum off of. Here's some resources. When it's a conversation and when it's informative, it's full of resource, and it's saying we're coming alongside each other, I think that's the important thing. A lot of times, though, I think youth pastors think they have to be the expert. And so then they step into being experts on things they know nothing about. And I remember one time when a newlywed children's ministry, it wasn't a youth worker, but it was in children's ministry. She was newlywed, she had no children, and she held a parenting class. And I sat there really going, okay, this could have been done so differently. So I think that's the thing. You don't have to be an expert. You just need to be a support and come alongside.
Well, I think that's great advice. Number one, if you're a youth pastor with no teenagers, maybe don't have a parenting class. Maybe you want to have a culture class, maybe to help parents navigate culture, but not necessarily telling parents how to raise their children before you, in fact, either A, have children, or B, have teenagers. Once again, these are traps that I fell into, that I thought I had to be the authority to gain respect, right? From the parents. I had to be the authority on how to disciple your kids and how to do these things. And I was the victim of that. So I'm not, listen, youth workers, I'm not calling you out. I'm just telling you what I went through. It's okay to take the humble route and ask questions like, hey, you know, parents, what's going on with your kids? What can I help with? Or what can I, you know, how can I serve you? Versus, let me tell you all about how to run your house, or, you know, any of those things. Now, parent ministry is a two-way street, I would say. Because not only do the youth workers have to engage, once you say it, putting out information, that's so critical. Make sure you have a calendar on time. Don't tell parents about the event the night before.
Right.
Don't do those things. That's just, you're sabotaging yourself at that point. You know, give information about what is the lesson about. What can I, you know, send home a little family thing. It says, here's some devotion you can have at home, things like that. But the other side of that is parents who, I would say you're the alpha parent, okay? You are the highly engaged. You care about the ministry because you have perspective. Your dad being a pastor, you understand all this. So you are in a different class of parent, I think, than what I would describe as the parent who is what time does the event start? When is it? What time does it start? And what time do I need to pick them up?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that's a different category of parent. How would you encourage then parent ministry on this side? How do you encourage parents to come alongside the youth pastor? Because I know every parent, the most important child in that room is their
Right.
child. It doesn't matter what your other issues are. What's in it for my kid?
Yeah.
How do we then go from what's in it for my kid? And by the way, youth pastors, you should take care of every child. Every child is important and precious. And please tell parents that that their child is the most precious child in the youth group. But how can a parent go past the calendar or the time or the events or the running the kids around and take another little step further to become more supportive in a parent ministry within the context of the youth ministry?
Yeah. Well, the first thing I was going to say was, remember, yours is not the only child there, because it's very easy to look at our world just from, how does it impact our schedule, our logistics, those things. So I'd say also ask a lot of questions, get to know what is the communication style of the youth pastor. Is his one word answer to your text because that's how he answers, or because you texted him at the wrong time of day? Just ask some of these questions. What's the best thing to do? And I think the thing that we often forget to ask too is, how can we pray for our youth pastors? Because they are, they're not the pastor, so they don't get the limelight, and they get some of the hardest congregants and they don't get good job recognition or, thanks or gratitude or any of that. And so I think sometimes they can go home at the end of the day feeling the most discouraged when they actually have probably the ripest ministry opportunity of anybody in the church. And so I think asking how we can pray, but I would also say, youth pastors, don't be afraid to say, hey, I need some people praying for me. Would you like to be on a list? And I'll send out, 2 or 3 things a month or whatever it is.
Yeah, to pray not only, and once again, youth pastors, you don't have to be like super personal, like, about your life, about prayer, but certainly prayer things for the youth ministry itself. An event coming up, would you be in prayer that, kids will come to know Christ? Or the retreat we're going on, pray that, we're able to get more students to be able to come, or, whatever that is. And that requires, Jennifer, it's such a good thing, but you have to have some vulnerability, youth workers, because listen, you are under, and I understand, we are middle management. We are between the literal rock and a hard place some days. We cannot please the people above us, and we cannot please the people beside us, and we cannot please the people beneath us. So in those areas, youth workers, you have to be vulnerable at some point to say, look, I need your help. I would say that was maybe the best thing I did in regards to parent ministry, is simply to say, I need your help. I don't need a task done. I need something done, but I desperately need you to pray for me. And I really need you to just come alongside and be supportive. Even if I'm wrong some days, help me, encourage me, help me see the error of my ways, especially if you're dealing with a younger youth worker, because sometimes they're paid to be the expert, right? They're not only they take the role of expert, they're paid to be the expert. So it's okay to say you don't know something. It's okay to say I don't have it all together. It's not okay to keep doing the wrong thing over and over again and expecting grace to just live forever amongst parents. Parents have their child in there, and they have some expectations, which is where I want to go next. Because once again, you are, like I said, the alpha parent, in my opinion, because you have a perspective. You told me 4 areas of expectations that you have, what you really want your child to get when they go to youth group or when they come out of youth ministry. Would you share those 4 things? I think they're so insightful. And youth pastors, if you're not taking notes, if you're not writing this down, I don't know what you're doing. You should be marking this down right now, because you have some Jennifers as parents who are looking and saying, I want something from your youth ministry. This is what I'm expecting. If you've not asked the question yet, you probably need to ask the question. What are your expectations? So Jennifer, share with us some of those expectations you have
Sure.
For youth ministry and your youth pastors.
Sure. So the first thing is I'm really looking for my student to be engaged and excited about their faith. I'm not looking for them to be entertained. It can be fun, but I just want to make that distinction, because I think a lot of the youth groups I see are going for the flash and the pizzazz, and it's exciting, but it's temporal. It was what was great. And I want to see consistent engagement and excitement about going, because they're growing in their faith. The second thing is I want to see discipleship and accountability. I want to know if they miss and they didn't tell them I'm going to be out of town. Somebody's going to say, hey, why weren't you there? What's going on? You know, are you reading your Bible? Are you looking these things up? Are you doing these things? The third thing I'm looking for, and this is a little more from the behind the scenes of the program, but I'm looking to see, is there intentionality behind what is done? Are there theological concepts and ideas, topics that are being touched on purpose? Or is it just sort of the flavor of the month? What's the missions exposure? You know, is there a plan to be local and then international? Is there a process, or is it just, oh, this happened to be a good opportunity, so we took it? And then what is being done to teach them how to share their faith with their friends? That's kind of all part of that intentionality. What is the goal when they walk out that door as a high school graduate? What were we hoping would happen? And then the last area is in community and relationship. And so depending on the size of the youth group, this can look very different. It might be very intentional small groups. It might be the group as a whole. But that sense of safety, that sense of being able to be vulnerable and honest, maybe not too much information inappropriate, but to have that ability to say, you know, I'm struggling. You know, my son has faced some things, truthfully, that I never imagined we would face. Friends with, you know, gender identity challenges and challenges because of technology that if you had told me 15 years ago, you know, when he was a little baby, that I'd be dealing with this with him, I would have thought you were nuts. So a place where he can be vulnerable and honest and ask questions. So those are kind of the four big things that you know, my husband and I are looking for in a solid youth ministry.
Well, and youth workers, by the way, I would take this and I would write down everything she just said, and then I would give it to your parents and say, here's what you can expect of me. And then you run your program accordingly, right? I mean, come up with that promise, right? I have an article that I wrote on the 3 big promises you should make your youth ministry. That should be one of them. You should make a promise to your parents that says, hey, here's what you can really expect from me as a youth worker and us as a youth ministry. And, you know, gather that information. Do a poll, do some of those, ask for expectations, you know, don't shirk them. Don't say, let me just run the program. Really, if you're engaging with parents, you're finding out what, and once again, all these expectations may be different because it's their child, but try to come across with a consensus of these things, which Jennifer just said, are across the board. I don't know any parents who don't want intentionality, don't want their children to learn how to share their faith, don't want openness and trying to help navigate cultural issues. And those are such great things that you can put out there before those parents. Now, we have here, Jennifer, I asked our YouTube audience here for some questions. I want to ask you those before we get to our last question. One of the questions was really long, and we talked about this because it won't necessarily fit on the, if I put this on the screen, which is probably on the screen right now, but really is, and my guess is a parent was asking this from JMCKASYRU, Jamaksu, I'll go there. Jamaksu asks, literally asking, what recommendations do you have for a parent because on discipling their own kids? Because I know that a lot of times youth group can be a surrogate parent and say, look, youth group's going to teach them all this stuff. I don't have to do very much. You know, that's why I send them to church. That's why I am offloading my responsibility for discipleship to the church or the youth group versus I taking some responsibility for doing that for my child as well. What are some recommendations? Because I sense in the question that they would like their child or any child to be fully committed, to love the Lord, and to be able to turn away from worldly things. What can a parent do from a discipleship perspective? What does that mean then to do that within your own home?
Sure. So that's an interesting question for me, because coming from a pastor's home, you would think that I experience things in a certain way. There's a lot of assumptions made. And as I was transitioning into college, it dawned on me, I knew my parents did personal devotions, but I'd never seen them do it. I didn't know where and when it took place because it was something they did, not in secret, but in private. And so I have struggled with, how do I model this for my kids? Because I just knew it happened. I didn't see it executed. So then I married my husband, and my mother-in-law does her devotions in their loft every morning, quietly by herself, but visibly. So her kids knew she gets up, she reads her Bible, she prays, and she does it for about this long. And so that's one thing I would say is, whether you experienced it or not, model it for your kids, whether you do it as family things together, or they just observe that you're doing it. Because that's a whole lot easier to emulate something you see modeled than it is to figure out how to do it on your own. And then I would say the other aspect of that discipleship is the working through things. I am a reluctant homeschooler. We've been doing it for 8 years. I never wanted to, but here I am. And one of the things that has been precious has been going through studies with my kids, very intentional studies. And while we're doing that as homeschoolers, because it's part of our, quote unquote, Bible requirement, anybody could do that. There's some fantastic studies that you can work through. There's a series that we've stumbled on where this gentleman has actually written a study for each year of school, I think starting in 6th grade. And so we worked through the sophomore year one together when our kids were sophomores, and it was fantastic. And then don't go it alone. So whether it's teaming up with other moms, or finding somebody like this youth worker that came alongside my daughter. We have a mom at our church who has, she's doing a thing with the girls, with our middle child. They get together a couple times a month for sisterhood. And they've worked through a book on purity, and they've worked on a book on things that to expect when, as you transition into middle school. And so they're doing it together with their friends. And it's been a safe environment. And we can take turns as moms doing those types of things. So I think there's a lot of ways you can integrate it in. But I think the key thing is understanding your child's personality and your personality. So don't do a word study if neither of you like to do that. Maybe get a video series instead, So I think that's the important part, is to do it. Doesn't matter how, just do it.
Yes. And so good. So good. Because parents are not, I think parents struggle with, having conversations maybe about it. The two perspectives are that the parent does nothing, or the parent tries to do everything. The parent says, we're going to talk about Jesus all the time,
right?
every moment of the day, so that I can, rally my child's faith. And I think that, like you said, there are times and moments where you can have these separate times and have these, whether they're devotional times, or just conversations, asking good questions about the music your child listens to. Like, what do you like about that song? What is it about that you like so much? Or what is it you like about that artist? And make them honest questions, not gotcha questions. Not like, I got you now. That's so sinful and you're a terrible person. We're gonna beat that out of you. And having those conversations. I think that's so important to keep it simple. But like you said, model it. So many young people that their only model they have is the youth pastor sometimes, because they've been on a missions trip with them. They've seen them do it in action. They've seen him or her share their faith. And parents, listen, if you want your child to do it, they have to have a model to do it. They have to see it done in the wild. They have to have, otherwise it's just theory. It's just something, it's just a good idea until they actually see, and every parent should be their kid's hero, right? I saw my mom or dad do this. That's why I do this thing, you know. And of course, there's special situations where a youth pastor comes along and fills certain gaps and roles, maybe in homes that don't have dads or things like that. So there's special conditions like that. Another question I have from Seth Lewis from Texas says, what is the biggest struggle that you deal with as a parent raising a teenager?
I think it's communication. And it's because, well, my son will ask a question and I'll say, what's your real question? Because he gives me some information, but not all the information. And he's leading me into a trap, intentionally or not. So, so it's this communication. And then vice versa, I'll ask him questions and I get one-word answers, or he's not interested in talking to me because he thinks I have an agenda. But really at the heart of the communication I've discovered is tone. And I can interpret his tone one way, he thinks it was communicated another, and vice versa. You know, I am mad more than I ever realized I was mad, because my kids are like, wow, you're so mad. I'm like, I didn't know that. But at the same time, I had read somewhere that that teenagers don't know what tone they're conveying. And so to not, as a parent, read into their tone and assume that it is communicating, to listen to their words, to ask more questions, to not jump to conclusions. But communication is by far the hardest thing, especially because they're so much more used to texting and not talking. So
and
I think
emojis.
Yes.
And gifts. And
memes and all of it. Yes.
Talking that. We don't even we don't need words.
Right.
Words are so overrated.
Yeah, I think effective communication is the hardest thing.
Wow. And I would agree. And even as they get older, it's still a challenge for like your children to like text you. Why don't you text me back? Yeah. I need to hear from you. Are you still alive, or where are you at?
Right.
What are you doing? So, Jennifer, we have had, I think, a phenomenal conversation here about parents in ministry, how to build relationships, how to come across from a youth pastor's point of view, to engage, not to be fearful, not to have to be the expert, but also from the point where we need parents to engage. We need parents to step up and say, hey, you know, I want to care about what you're doing, because this is our youth and this is our, you know, the future and the next generation, all those things. But I have a feeling that there are youth pastors listening right now, and they are dealing with that parent.
Yeah.
That parent. Now you can define that parent
however you want.
That parent could be anything. Whatever your that parent is, how would you encourage a youth pastor to work with that parent? That could be the helicopter parent. It could be the overbearing parent. It could be the do it my way parent. It could be the I'm taking my kid out of youth group if you don't change things parent. Yeah. How do you encourage a youth worker or youth pastor to engage with that parent?
Sure. Well, I'm going to back up a little bit and say, 3 years ago, we unexpectedly adopted these babies, and they were pulled from the homes that they knew and where they felt safe, and they were in our house. And they didn't know, they weren't old enough to understand that those were temporary homes and we're a permanent home. It changed their world. And it was a hard transition. And so along the way, we had to learn a lot about their experience, trauma, connection, relationship, building trust. And one of the things we learned is that all behavior, regardless of age, is communication. And so we had to figure out what was being communicated so that we could respond to that need. And the frustrating thing was that sometimes they would throw their food and they were hungry. And you're like, well, just eat it, why? But once we could focus on kind of, connecting with our kids so they could be calm and engaging, then we could solve the problem. And I think the same principle applies to that parent. So before confronting a parent, try to connect with them. Ask them questions, have casual conversations, learn their story, because you might discover, and this actually was a situation my dad dealt with on early as a pastor. I was really small, but maybe their husband was the youth pastor who had an affair with a student and left her. And you don't know their perspective that they're coming from. And so there's a general mistrust of you as a youth pastor. That's extreme, but it could be an unsupportive spouse. It could be stress at work. It could be a hard upbringing. It could be a language barrier and a lost in translation culturally with something. So figure out what it is. And then once you have that better understanding, then you can effectively work towards correcting things in a way that builds that relationship. And then they probably will no longer be that parent. And it might be as simple as tweaking communication, moving it from email to texting so that it's not lost in the whole list of emails, but they see it. Or it might be understanding that because of a previous loss, even though you don't want parents on premises, they need to be present so they know their child's safe. It might require exceptions. It might mean that their kid's not communicating with them, and so they're asking you questions because you're the lifeline between them and their child right now. Yeah. But once you've connected and you've corrected this, then be consistent. And if you promise to do something, do it. And if you set a boundary, keep it.
This whole episode, Jennifer, is worth that right there. It's just the best practices. You just summed up the best practice for dealing with that parent is to know their story, to know where they come from. So many times we're trying to defend ourselves as youth workers. We're trying to defend ourselves. It's like the blows are furious, like, ha, ha, hey. And we're like, okay, so rather than go and fight this battle, dig a little deeper. And I love to, I always had an open door policy where if a parent wanted to come in and sit in on a session, we invited them. We said, please come watch what we're doing. Youth pastors, let me encourage you, a parent's not going to mess up your program by sitting in the program. But if you invite them, if you're trying to keep them out, then that tells parents you're trying to hide something. Right. You don't want to hide something. So you want to be open and say, look, why don't you come for a night and just kind of see what we're doing? You don't have to participate. In fact, we'd rather you not. We'd rather you just come in and observe of what we're doing. And then, of course, feedback is always welcome. Please let me know how I can better serve your child and what we can do. Jennifer, thank you so much. This has been a tremendous episode here where I could see youth pastors and parents re-listening to this and playing it for their staff and playing it for other people and saying, you've got to listen to this episode about parents and good parent ministry and youth ministry from a parent's perspective. Because I know you have some other things as a mom, you're doing some things, some cool stuff. Where can youth workers either ask more questions or find maybe a resource or two with something? I know that you have something planned for our listeners today. Sure. And they can get. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I'm a blogger at moremommymoments.com is my blog. That's also my Instagram if you want to connect that way. But if you go to moremommymoments.com/10ways, 10ways, then I'll have a resource that I'll email you on 10 ways to build connections between families and youth ministry workers.
That resource, youth workers, if you're not getting that right now, there's no hope. I can't help you. You don't want help. You just go get it and download it and then give it to your leaders and work with parents, and phenomenal. And so, yes, all of these, by the way, youth workers, all of her connections and everything else will be down in the show notes or down in the description there on YouTube. And so, Jennifer, thank you so much. Thank you for coming on here and sharing a parent's perspective of youth ministry so concisely, so passionately, that youth workers can hear it without it being yelled at them sometimes, because sometimes all they hear is yelling and noise and their phone blowing up. And you've put this in such a great context where youth workers can really hear what a parent is saying.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.